So a lot of what we're going to discuss and work with today with poetry is informed by what I saw on the 2 timed writings that were turned in this week. So some did do poetry for the second timed writing that was due on Tuesday. Some did it just for Mondays. Well, we all did it Monday. So just based on, hey, what did I notice? It's going to inform kind of how we're moving here. And a big reminder, when we talk about poetry, it's all about conveying that experience. Remember, poetry isn't about information. It's about how do we build that idea to understand the other person's perspective. To help us to get to that experience we've said all year, we can dump the informational part by creating a 1-sentence summary. And that's important because a lot of people fell back in writing these essays on summarizing the poem. All you were doing was telling me what literally happened or how ideas are developed literally in the events of the poem that are depicted, rather than really looking at what's his experience part. So let's start here. If you had to summarize the poem in 1 sentence, how would you do that?
I said generational expectations.
I would say that that's an idea that's there. It's kind of into that experience part, but it definitely can come in here. Generational expectations. Okay. Anything else we want to kind of convey in a summary?
But Dad has anxiety that he'll disappoint his son, and then
This poem, digging.
Wait, what?
We're working with digging. Monday's poem was a story, so that was the one that talked about the dad. Today we're talking about digging. Anything else we want to include here in our 1-sentence summary?
Changing of tradition.
Yeah. I definitely think it goes right along with that generational expectation bit. How would we define the speaker? Like, what do we know about the speaker? He's a writer. What does he do within the poem? And you brought up this generational expectations and changing things. What is his process in the poem? Why does he think about generations, and why does he think about these changing things?
Because he's not.
He's not doing what they're doing. And so if I was going to write this summary, I might say, a writer questions his profession when compared to his father and grandfather. Does this work as a 1-sentence summary of what we see in the poem? So this kind of gives us that sense of, okay, this is not what my essay is going to be about. We all know that. If I was going to add anything to it, I might add a statement that kind of gets into this idea of expectations and change. To say, like, something to kind of address his feelings that he processes. Both his father and grandfather are portrayed as working physically with their muscles, and he feels as though his profession, there's a certain inadequacy to it comparatively. And so when we look at this idea, we're going to get to that with the experience. That's where we're going to be able to leap off of. But we want to be focused on, this is not the focus of our essay. This is just, hey, what's it about? Our purpose when we write about poetry is to be able to talk about how meaning is created. If this is the meaning, here is where we take the jump to start to go, how is that created? And when we start to look, we want to be focused on what are the prominent literary devices we see used, but we don't want them to be the focus of our argument eventually. This is where we take the middle step of going, what do we notice? We always want to link the device we see to the meaning that's created. Being able to recognize a metaphor or a use of imagery is wonderful, but it doesn't help us to understand how meaning is created. It just kind of points it out. So let's look at the poem and just brainstorm for a moment. What are some of the prominent literary techniques you see used by Seamus Heaney? Imagery. What else? Yeah. We definitely can have a discussion about diction, metaphors. I would include what we call selection of detail. We've talked about this. Why does an author make certain choices? And how do those choices impact the poem or the work as a whole? So think for a second, if we're looking here, if we're going to start, he chooses to focus on his father and his grandfather. Both male figures. He could have focused on his mom and dad. He could have focused on his mom and grandmother, but instead he stays to the male side. Does this choice help us to understand something about the experience that's conveyed? Can you?
Oh,
Sure.
as a man, like from the perspective of a man, he's not equal to what they do.
Yeah. So we can carry over this idea that we said sort of is there, and it's how we're building that inadequacy. Here we have two, generational pieces that worked with their hands. And even as he is writing this, what is he seeing out the window? Yeah, even as the speaker is writing the poem, he says he looks out the window and he sees his dad working in the garden, even then digging and doing. So it's like, here I sit trying to write and I watch this older man work and I think back to this person that worked. And man, how can I say that I'm a man, that I have a profession, that I have these pieces with that? These are selected details. Now, they may be true about Heaney. They may be true here, but we have to remember that the speaker is not the poet. We don't want to confuse those ideas. We want to look at what is presented here and think about it as conscious choices. If he presented his father one way, but his grandfather a different way, we couldn't see this idea as strongly. For me, when I look at this, my father had a more like office-y kind of job. versus my grandfather's. One was a carpenter, the other literally was a dock worker. Like he shoveled asbestos off of a ship without a mask on, kind of dock worker. And so when I look at that, I definitely wouldn't have the same kind of thing if I drew from my experience, because my dad doesn't have that connection. He went to college, he had an office job, it doesn't work. But here in what we get presented, we can see these ideas being developed because of the conscious choices he's making. Let's pick another of these. Let's stick with imagery. Why not? That was the first one that came up. Tell me some of the images that come up here and the uses of imagery that help us to see this meaning being created. So can you point to like a specific example of that? Because we have, of course, two different generations of examples. So the father digging potatoes, we have that. But we also have the grandfather, as they say, cutting turf. Heaney is Irish. And so we need to think about this idea of, if you aren't familiar, they literally would cut out sections of the bog and burn it. Once it was dried out, they would use it for fuel. So they literally would cut out parts of the ground and lift them out. And so you think about that hard physical labor that we have. Let's look at the grandfather, for example. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 in terms of stanzas, even 8. What are some of the images presented? Or, again, doesn't have to be all about your eyes. Imagery is about senses. What senses are we tapping into with the grandfather? Yeah, if you look at line 25, there you have some great examples. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat. And of course, they were talking about the peat moss, what they were actually cutting out in these sections of turf. So we got squelch and slap. We've got smell of potato mold. Are these attractive uses of imagery? No, they're kind of gross. So notice how we're also pulling in an adjective to modify the type of imagery that we're using. Does this make you want to go out and work like his grandfather did? No. But think about where he is. He is inside. He is trying to work with his pen and doing these things. So he is protected and comfortable and thinking about all of this difficulty. An image that always sticks with me, if you go back a couple of stanzas, when they introduce his grandfather, this is like line 19 and 20. He talks about carrying him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. How many of you, when you have a hard day's work like this, physical labor, can't wait to get a glass of milk? You're like, that's going to totally do it for me. No. And even think about how we drink milk. It's cold. You think this milk he's bringing him is cold? No. And not even that, but then you also add to it, like, how's the bottle like kept closed? They just shove some paper in there and it's corked sloppily. So is that like nice, clean, good paper that you used? No. This is all like gross and rank pieces of imagery. Does it progress as the poem goes on? Most of the examples that we're pulling are from the back end here. Is it as gross and intense as he talks about his father? No. So would this come into your idea of the change across generations? Uh-huh. Do you see how we're moving from, hey, I can talk about just this one thing, to, hey, let's put it to some definites. Let's modify to see what we're seeing. And how does it build into that larger meaning? Everybody following what I'm doing here? When we're looking here, these are the steps that we need to take as we get towards, hey, how do we write about this? And how do we create those thematic statements that we're going to do today? Anybody talk to me about the metaphor of the poem? We're even going to take away the S. This poem has a strong central metaphor to it. Can anybody define it?
Is it the pen?
Is it what?
The pen? The pen.
The pen? It involves the pen.
To be doing something like in spirit, because he says, live not kind of big with them, so like, I don't know.
No, you're right there. You're right there. We haven't done this year because I feel like at this point, if I pulled it out and I did it, you would just like groan at me. Ugh. Remember back previous years where teachers would have you do that TP cast kind of outline for how to look at poetry? And you'd have to go through and it was like, hey, look at the title. Hey, look at this. Hey, do this now. Is this ringing a bell for you? Remember that once you go through the majority of it, at the end, there are 2 T's. The second is theme, but the next to last is title. And it has you go back and reevaluate the title of the piece. Now, you're right there on that thing with, is it in spirit? Because yes, it helps to understand the central metaphor. The central metaphor of this poem is about digging. It is a metaphor for a very particular reason. We have the physical part that is literal, right? Father and grandfather dig. We get it. We've talked about it. Anybody want to talk to me about the metaphorical piece? And this is where you were going, Lay, so I think you got it. How does he dig? By writing. And this is where I was kind of looking at you, Calista, to go, yes, it involves it. Notice that he wants to talk about the shovels of his father and his grandfather, the tools that they use to physically do their job. He links it to his pen. Think about how within this piece, as he thinks about this idea, the imagery becomes stronger. The diction becomes stronger. The tone becomes stronger because as a writer, he's literally digging into the topic the same way he's thinking about and watching out the window, literally his father dig in the garden. If we can talk about how this central metaphor helps to control it, we can look at specifically the beginning and end of the poem. Did you notice that there is a symmetry to them? If you look at the first stanza and the last stanza, they're parallel in structure. Both present similar things. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. Both have it. At the very beginning, he introduces this idea of it being snug as a gun. Now, this is an idiomatic phrase. Obviously, can you shoot someone with a pen? No, you can throw a pen really hard and you're still not going to puncture their skin necessarily. We're talking about the idea of something being snug into the palm of your hand like a gun. That's the idiom of it, where we're talking about how you're holding it. But it also brings about this idea of power. This is where we can bring in diction. He understands the power of what he can do. But at the beginning, has he fired the gun yet? So a gun is only powerful if you actually, well, it doesn't have to be used. Still can intimidate people and do what you need to. But Think about this gun as an unfired gun at the beginning, and as we go through the poem, he only does fire it then to realize, yeah, it can be powerful. So there's potential at the beginning, and by the end, we see the potential realized. He doesn't need the metaphor anymore because he can state quite clearly, last line, I'll dig with it, being the pen. I will do my job this way. I will dig through meaning. I will have those pieces. Are we seeing how some of this is developed? And we didn't talk about some of these others. Sensory details. There's a lot of work that we can still do with diction here to bring it through. Look at how many times he keeps talking about digging, digging, digging. If you went to like, how he describes the shovel and you look at the words that are there with it, a lot of that brings in these ideas that he wants to get to. There's a ton that we have here that you can pull to use as a way to talk about meaning here. What we want to look at, though, is this is not our argument. Some of us still think, hey, I will just organize my essay based on this. So I'll do a whole paragraph on imagery. Do you notice how we're talking about father and grandfather? We're talking about father and grandfather. We're talking about father and grandfather. These things don't work in isolation. So if you're building these paragraphs on their own based on just this, we're missing the opportunity to talk about how these ideas play together. And instead, we've got to make the move towards how do we form this as an argument? That's our essay. We want to start to look at, if we've got these pieces, what are the major movements that we see? One thing we have suggested is to talk about the poem chronologically. Ideas develop over time in a work, and we see that here. He introduces the idea in the first stanza. He explores it as he goes through, only in the last stanza to solidify. And you can see the moments in the poem where he comes back to it and he starts to realize the truth of what he's doing. Think about if you look down and you look at what line is that? 24. At the end of the stanza where he just has digging as its own sentence. He's starting to get the idea there, and we can see that. As we frame this argument, we now want to look at, okay, what are the major chunks and movements? How can I frame my paragraphs around that? So we said first stanza. It introduces the idea. How does the poem move from the first stanza? What's the second major chunk that we have? Don't overthink it. What's the first, we've talked about it. Exactly. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're using the structure of the poem and how he's exploring ideas to help us to be able to frame. How's this poem about experience and what does it have to say? We could absolutely build a 4-paragraph essay that pulls this together. Maybe 5 because we need a thesis too, at the very least, a short introduction. But we're getting there. We're starting to see, okay, I don't need to rely there. Instead, if I talked about in my grandfather paragraph, how does the imagery and the selection of detail play together? How do those help us to see that central metaphor of digging even stronger? What diction choices stand out in there? Remember we said these aren't buttons on a video game that Seamus Heaney is working like it's like I have to hit this button, this button, this button. Oh, I need a high punch. High punch. They work together. They're not always intentional choices. Our next step would then to be, okay, let's start to frame out this thesis statement. And looking at the thesis statements that we got on these essays, all of us are leaving the money on the table consistently in the thesis statement in two ways. We have said all year there are three parts to a good thesis. 99% of us have part one down. When we're writing a thesis, we have the subject clarified. Who's the author? What's the title of the work? We got that. I would say on the story piece that we did, we're probably about 60% on our A. And the way we get our A, our assertion, is to actually answer the question. So if you think back to, hey, what was Monday's? It was, what's the complex relationship between the Father and the Son? I would say at least 40% of us in the thesis just wrote that there's a complex relationship between the Father and the Son. You're not answering the question. You're not telling me anything. So you missed your opportunity there to lay your money on the table and actually guide your essay. Instead, you're just kind of like, oh yeah, I'll get to it. No, that's not your purpose. We got to answer the question. And here, I would say we are probably closer to 20 to 25% that actually included a theme in their thesis. So that they could say, if there's a complex relationship between the Father and the Son, what does that complex relationship help us to understand about experience as a whole? And, even something as simple as love, boom, it gives you direction now. So that you're not just talking about the Father and the Son and repeating yourself. You have a direction to take about what you're talking about. Think about what we have here with this poem. We've already defined our theme pretty strongly. We've said things like inadequacy. Oh yeah, I totally misspelled that. You could even say that it's about manhood. Again, we have presentations of these are the figures that I'm supposed to follow. They were real men. They worked with their hands. Who am I sitting inside with a pen? Got lots of pieces that we could do. Let's talk about this one here. If we were going to write a thesis statement for this, obviously we don't have a question. What do you think the central meaning of the poem is? Because remember, our summary is one thing, but this is about experience. We understand he eventually gets to this thing. What do you think the central idea of the poem is? Mm-hmm. It's that questioning bit. That moment to question your existence. It helps us to understand his sense of inadequacy and his lack of manhood. What we want to do today, instead of going to thesis, because again, we don't have an actual prompt here, is we want to write a thematic statement. So a thematic statement kind of reframes that thesis bit. We're writing about this theme. One of these or something that you see, and being able to talk about what does the work have to say about it. Being able to tell me that manhood is the theme is great, but this work has a very particular statement about manhood. Inadequacy can happen in a lot of ways. I'm a tall guy. If I stand next to somebody who's like 5'5", they're probably going to feel inadequate because they're just like, oh, look, he's tall. I'm not. Ooh. And it's okay. I'll just go up and look down at them and pat their head and be like, it's all right, champ. Anyway, we want to think here about that idea. Turn this into a thematic statement. How does he make a statement about the theme? In one sentence, write it out. That is all I want you to turn in today. I want you to actually do the campus assignment. One sentence, write that thematic statement, and then turn it into Canvas.